Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you very much for joining us on this second day of Meeting on the Med. My name is John Hadden. I'm co-founder and chief executive of ViroCell Biologics. I'm joined here by a wonderful panel, and what I'd like to do is ask quickly each of them to introduce themselves, and then we'll get to the task at hand. So Hilary, would you like to start, please?
I'd love to. Can you hear me? All right. So Hilary Schultz, CEO and founder of Persephoni BioPartners. We're a venture studio that focuses in the therapeutics or therapeutic enabling devices. We currently operate 6 portfolio companies. We're anchored in Philadelphia but operate elsewhere, and recently just launched a seed fund. So we're very excited about that. So nice to be here. Thank you very much, John.
Thank you. Maryam?
And I'm Maryam Mokhtarzadeh. I'm Senior Director of Regulatory Strategy at REGENXBIO. We're a gene therapy company with multiple programs, wide range of indications.
My name is Sadik Kassim. I'm CSO of Genomic Medicines at Danaher. Danaher is not a therapeutics company, but it's a global life science and diagnostics company that works with many of the innovators in the ecosystem, from translational researchers to biotechs to big pharma. And relevant to this panel, we launched a partnership with the Innovative Genomics Institute in Berkeley about a year ago with Jennifer Doudna to enable a platform for accelerating the development of gene-edited drug products for rare disorders.
Thank you. Hilary?
And I'm the other Hilary. Hilary Eaton, Chief Business Officer of Profluent. Perhaps a little bit of an odd duck on the panel. We are an AI company founded by the folks from Salesforce and OpenAI who did ChatGPT, but turning the large language models to learning the language of proteins and being able to write novel protein therapeutics. And some of the ones that we've open sourced have been gene editors that are relevant for rare disease treatment. Thanks for having me.
Excellent. Great. I should have said ViroCell, we're an innovation-driven CDMO. We focus on vector design and de-risking, and then accelerating innovations into clinic. So we're averaging thus far about 158 days from thaw to QP release of vector product. So if we can support you, we'd love to do that. That's the pitch. So our challenge today is how to help think about supporting not-for-profits, and the way we're going to attack it, we're going to do this in a bit of a case study approach. Okay? So here, the stage is set in the following manner. There's a family who are friends of ours whose child has been diagnosed with a rare disease. It's a family of significant means, and they're establishing a not-for-profit de novo. And they've assembled this team of friends to help advise on how to navigate that path. I think we'll all agree that that path is as challenging as it is for any biotech or pharma company. And often not-for-profits do this in the context of little to no experience, not all for sure. But let's visualize what success is. Success is a gene therapy, an intervention that markedly changes disease course, maybe is curative, that the patient is willing to take, and that payors are willing to reimburse. So we've got a really unique group of people here in the room, or I should say on the stage. And let's start first with the patient. Hilary Eaton, would you like to focus on this? Is us collectively giving the family advice on the setup of this new not-for-profit.
Sure. So I have a little bit of a unique perspective. I've been working at gene editing companies for about a decade, and early in my career saw the promise of CRISPR and CRISPR technologies for rare genetic disease. And whether it be serendipity or irony, it turns out that after a decade of working at these gene editing companies, both myself and my 2 young daughters have a rare genetic disease. So I can very well sort of imagine what's going on in the mind of this patient. Perhaps uniquely, though, with the perspective of having a PhD and having spent a decade at editing companies, it's still sort of an overwhelming thing to happen, and to think about, how do I coordinate care, who's working on this, and how do I get something to help my child, when the reality of most for-profit companies in this space is that they are pressed into advancing programs that have larger patient populations, because those are the only things that are going to ultimately become reimbursed. So I would say, the number one thing is network. Figure out who is thinking creatively about gene therapy and gene editing therapies, and talk to as many people as you can as possible. There are so many resources out there in the nonprofit and the for-profit world. We think about biotech as sort of, always going after the money, trying to figure out what the pricing of that drug is, right? But there are also a lot of tools and things available at biotech companies that are open for collaboration. We're seeing that as potentially federal funding and other sources sort of dry up, some combination of biotech money and venture philanthropy can sort of fill that gap.
Do you want to talk a bit about the patient advocacy groups and the importance thereof?
100%. So that's, if you look at, even listening to some of the earlier panels, how parents have gotten treatments for their children that have ultra-rare diseases. A lot of it stems from patient advocacy groups getting them in touch with the right people. And also trying to figure out sort of what risks are these patients and their families willing to undergo? What does their quality of life look like? It's, when I was at Editas going through my first experience of a clinical indication pipeline prioritization exercise, everybody's there for the patient, right? But it is, you can feel as much empathy as you want, but it is a very sort of arm's length, abstract, hypothetical concept to look through these sheets of the symptoms that exist for some of these diseases. When it's you, when it's your kid, all of a sudden it becomes a very different issue, and translating some of that into actual action, that's what patient advocacy groups are great at doing. They're phenomenal resources, and you can look at places like cystic fibrosis, where really it's the patient association that has led to dollars coming in through a variety of means.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. So Maryam, in addition to the many cool things you've done in your career, in addition to being a physician surgeon, you spent 12 years at FDA. So as this family is, let's assume also in this case that they've identified a novel intervention, that researcher has achieved proof of concept, and they're thinking about clinical development with this success objective in mind. Given your 12 years of experience there, what would you provide as direct advice to this family?
Well, I'd have to say that know the strength of your voice. I think the patient's voice is critical and powerful during development, and being heard early in development can really drive the course. During that time I was at FDA, I was also volunteering and participating in clinical trials at NIH in the ophthalmic genetics branch. And from that, what I saw is during development of the clinical trial, when it's clear to the folks writing the protocols and thinking about really significant endpoints that ultimately impact product success later, knowing what matters to the patient is incredibly valuable, and capturing that in the analysis and understanding of a product. And from the FDA perspective, the same things are true in the review of a product as it goes through investigational applications all the way to marketing approval. Understanding what is valuable to the patient is very important to that review process, and having that patient voice and patient-centric mindset can be very impactful.
So picking up on conversation that we had yesterday evening, there is institutional memory at the FDA, for example, but it's only human to be able to retain a certain amount of information. So what piece of advice would you give with respect to understanding the relative expertise that the sponsor has versus the reviewer?
So one of the things that always fascinated me when I came to industry was that there are times folks look at the FDA and want them to tell industry, what is your path? What is the path? What do we need to do? And the reality is truly that industry and patients that are involved in developing products are the experts, both in the room and in the lab in many ways. And so own that expertise. The reality is, especially at this point in time, at least in the US, we are seeing a huge turnover in agency staff. And I would say now more than ever, it's critical to go in to the regulatory body with your narrative, with your story. Make it easy for people to understand the history of where you're coming from, the logic in what you're doing. I think those things are always valuable, but especially now.
And picking up again on last night's conversation, is the reviewer really there to help, or is the reviewer there to say, not so much?
You know, I will tell you that having worked at various points in my career in the Center for Devices, Center for Drugs, and Center for Biologics, and also in the Office of the Commissioner, each area of the agency goes through an evolution, I feel like, periodically, where reviewers are actually told that it's their job to find the yes. While they're not industry consultants, they are often encouraged and empowered by leadership to look at every submission as an opportunity that needs to be rescued, that deserves to have a chance. And so I think, again, going back to my response before, writing the narrative and making it easy for those reviewers to find the yes definitely helps your case. When the narrative isn't as clear, I think, again, depending on where leadership in the agency is in that cycle of reviewer mentality, you know, you really want to enroll the reviewer in your success and make it clear to them where they can kind of help you carve out that benefit-risk profile for which your product deserves to live on.
Thank you. So, Sadik and Hilary, you both have very unique and different perspectives. So, Hilary, could you describe a little bit about the novel models that you've seen that have worked, and also maybe identify some of the gaps that may be there that capital needs to flow to fill?
No, certainly, happy to do so. You know, when we look at the point source of the technologies, I think there's a statistic out there, 95% of the technologies we see in patients today had a point of origin in the academic setting, or at least a portion of. And so when you look at rare diseases, and this goes to patient advocacy orgs or patients or otherwise, or persons I want to support, there's many academic labs and settings that focus on rare disease. But it typically is not super, I would call it commercially sexy, for lack of better terms. And so sometimes it stays warehoused in an academic setting, and parts or portions of the technology are used for alternate purposes. And I've seen this many times. What bridges that, and when I've seen it successful, is when you have a family or I would call it a microphone, so to speak, to draw attention on a rare disease. When you put that individual with capital access in a room with inventors or researchers that have a viable candidate to pursue, and then you marry in a patient advocacy organization that's going through the exercises of finding and identifying the patients and pairing and matching them with that technology, that's where I've seen the magic happen. And so it's really about what mechanisms are out there to facilitate that line of access and sight. There's also many technologies, and I'm quite personally passionate about rare disease. One of my best friends' son was diagnosed, and I operate out of Philadelphia, the cell and gene therapy capital of the world, and I would say in many conversations I was trying to find something that could fit the mold and model. And so there's a lot of viable technologies out there that could be utilized in a rare disease indication, but it's going to an alternate indication. And so transparency, access, awareness to information. Lastly, I would say on the order of funding, I think rare diseases have a secret weapon, and that is they have some of the most convicted, passionate persons behind it. And if they're given an opportunity to have a microphone, a voice, I think it's an amazing conviction. And I loved when we met the other day and you said how welcome the FDA is within rare disease, in the IRB submission, but it's engaging early and making sure you're checking the box. And it's the building backwards mindset. So, yeah.
Excellent. Sadik, you said something during our practice session, which was very profound, and that is the IND is just the start of the journey. It's not the end. And the conversation that then ensued talked a bit about scale, reproducibility, and leveraging best practices. So from your perspective, what advice would you give to the family that wants to form this new not-for-profit?
Yeah, I think the lessons learned from each new IND application really enable the broader field. And I think that's something that I've seen in the rare disease community. It's that information sharing, that openness, but how do you enable a mechanism that convenes that knowledge to really leverage for other indications so that it goes beyond your particular set of disorders and to benefiting the broader field. Because, from my vantage point, Danaher, we have a pretty good vantage point across the entire ecosystem. You see a lot of mistakes. I don't want to say mistakes, but a lot of the reinvention of the wheel. Like, people aren't necessarily learning from each other. And the mandate of the FDA is obviously not to share what they've seen from other applicants because that's proprietary information. So you need to have venues or forums where best practices are shared between the developers. And things as basic as critical quality attributes. It's interesting, the FDA will post the filing after a commercial approval, and sometimes they'll have like the table of release criteria for a drug product. And then sometimes the release criteria are blacked out for things as basic as like sterility and endotoxin. Like, this isn't proprietary information. Like, you need to have a sterile drug product. It needs to meet a certain compendial amount. So I think sometimes people think that they have something which is proprietary, which isn't necessarily proprietary. And I think we can learn from other industries that have really enabled massive growth by enabling more open access and information sharing. And I'm thinking here of the semiconductor industry, and to a certain degree, the artificial intelligence industry, where you have groups like Google, Meta, the DeepSeek folks making some of their architecture open source so that it enables broader development. So I think there's industries that we can benefit from that have leveraged open source to enable rapid development. And that's where the statement about the IND is only the starting point. I mean, it's a big milestone to get to an IND, but then it's everything subsequent to that enables you to now scale this product and give provide access to the broader field. Because there's so many examples of things that are curative that get to commercial launch, but then there's no business model, quote unquote, no business model, and then they're shelved. The assets are stranded. And if I was a patient, I think I would be almost more angry about the stranded asset than the fact that there is no asset.
Right.
So sort of.
It's interesting because it's an analogous issue with biotechs, right? We as an industry repeat that and reinvent the wheel over and over and over again. And so maybe there's an opportunity for foundations to really leverage best practices. And so in light of that, how would you, anybody here on the panel, how would you advise the foundation to go after expertise? because I think sometimes when you've got a new platform and you don't have old habits, you have the chance to write the playbook anew. Emily? Sorry, Emily to my left, excuse me. Emily Eaton.
I think one of the things that I would say is, so Profluent is a tech-first AI protein design company. And it's really interesting when you have investors and founders that come from a hardcore tech world, right? They have very different ideas about how to open source or spur rapid innovation, right? I don't know what the saying is, like, move fast, break it, fix it, all of that kind of stuff, right? That's just not what we do in biotech, though, right? We don't open source things. We don't make things available necessarily to other people. It's all sort of, within. And I'm not trying to dig at the patent system or anything like that. I think there's a very real reason why we have ended up in the system that we have right now. But that doesn't always work for rare disease. And so, one of the things that I'd put a plug for in is that, AI is not a magic wand that's going to fix things across there's so many bottlenecks if you look at the process of what's stopping rare disease scale up and commercialization. There are problems with sort of the discovery and development stage. A kid's born with a de novo mutation, and sometimes you can't make a therapy fast enough for that kid, right? Then you have to figure out how you're going to manufacture something potentially for a very small population, but still GMP, still super expensive. Then you have the regulators to deal with. You have payers who say, I don't know, there's 5 patients for this. Why do I want to reimburse this? Prove the value here, right? So it's all along the ecosystem that you have these sort of bottlenecks, right? One of the things I think we're going to see over the coming years is that AI can play a crucial role in the discovery and development stage of therapeutics. If you have a foundational model that's capable of designing a novel editor, a novel therapy for a patient that is safe in a matter of weeks, you might actually shorten those timelines and have something that you are able to give a young patient with a super severe disease. Now, that requires not just the AI platform, but collaboration with everybody in the industry to come together and say, how are we going to manufacture this? Are there models by which you have sort of for-profit companies that are able to divert a portion of their for-profit income to some of these things that are a little bit more pro bono or nonprofit to say, it shouldn't just be that we're fixing sickle cell patients through 10 different programs. It's also that we want to go after some of these rare monogenic diseases.
So Maryam or Hilary Schultz, question. During our practice session, we talked a bit about gaps in the market, the importance of natural histories or registries that track, or missing tools of scale. Could you each please comment, Maryam first, on that?
Sure, absolutely. So just to talk about the humans that can help as well to balance the really exciting AI possibilities, there are actually 2 things I would say. First of all, as a patient, you have an extraordinary opportunity to really be part of a community often in the rare disease world, where you can really enroll others that are in similar situations, again, in the success of the program. And one powerful way I've seen is folks that get ahead of starting to build a really powerful and impactful natural history data source, so that when the product is ready for clinical trial, there is available data on natural history with enough detail and enough substance to really be leveraged, sometimes in lieu of a control arm or a placebo. Because ultimately, when you're talking about small numbers, as you are in rare diseases, for these studies, often a huge hurdle becomes interpretability of data, right? So getting ahead of that, thinking about what you can start building before the product may ever even be ready for clinical trial is really valuable. The other shameless plug I'm going to add on the human perspective, building on what was said before, is that while a lot of details are not released by the agency on submissions, those reviewers at the agency have a lot of knowledge that's not public, and we have a lot of folks right now that are looking for jobs. So there's a lot of expertise and history that could be tapped into. That's the other shameless plug.
Taking notes.
My former colleagues, I have to look out for them.
No, I love that. Thank you for that. You know, when on the public and private partnerships, I've seen a lot of material traction in that. And when you think of scale and design, you shared in the history work in identifying patients and doing the sequencing. You know, we know that within rare disease, there's a lot of heterogeneity across the stratification of those mutations. And so you can say you have X rare disease, but point source, if it's 10,000 or below, you may only be able to capture, identify, and mobilize around 2,000 of those patients. And so when we're thinking earlier, and we have on board within our portfolio company now technologies that can enable rare disease, or advocating for treating rare disease, you have to be able to fund it. And who you get for first point of funding is really important. And I would say going into a funding scenario where we're raising capital on this technology, that historical identification of the patients is probably one of the most critical data sets. And that is that we can quantifiably justify and validate that this is the number of patients that have this rare disease. Ergo, there is purpose and rationale and some commercial viability on a capital component that it makes sense and it's worth pursuing. You also have to think of the phenotype of the investors that you're engaging with, family offices or otherwise, persons that have championed in the patient advocacy organizations. You could look at it this way. It's, if you're trying to scale, right? So one of the components that we're focusing on within our venture studio, which will probably control C and V, our venture studio for a rare disease purpose, is if you can identify technologies that can cover across multiple rare disease indications, where the capital upfront of validating that technology is front-loaded, but the beneficiaries are multiple indication spaces. So if it's loops, repeats, splicing, or whatever mechanism that needs to be done, you can cover. Now that takes point source and identifying more rare diseases and the patients, but you can do so and make the unit economics much more efficient, and then you build in pipeline manufacturing and scalable systems and rinse and repeat with our friends at the FDA. I think there's wholly viability in that. So if I had my dream, John, it would be after this meeting, all of those that want to tackle rare disease, that we can go sit at the bar, and we're gonna need to find some funding, and we're gonna need to find some technology, and some persons that are just like feverishly ambitious to do something about it. Over the last months, and since founding Persephoni, I've engaged with quite a few patient advocacy organizations. And you can think of the patient, but some of the rare diseases in the pediatric space disrupts the entire trajectory of families, where you have caregivers and they're not able to work. You have siblings that are impacted. You have the costs and economic constraints on that family. And so, in my sense is by virtue of supporting rare diseases, it's like you're lifting generations. Even outside of that particular disease. So I'm happy to meet any of you after the meeting. I'd love to have a conversation about it.
Excellent. I think something that we didn't touch on as a group is the importance of leadership. And although this isn't a narrow CGT category, I think there's some lessons and some examples that are pretty impressive. So from a personal family situation, watching Alzheimer's, and watching what the Alzheimer's Drug Discovery Foundation has done. They've really created a proper venture philanthropy. And I think leveraging insights from those kinds of institutions so as to avoid the mistakes they've made, but I think focus on hiring professional management, because the family is the best mission-guided missile board of directors, but you need a team of people to be able to corral the experts in the room. And I think maybe we made a mistake in not having somebody on the reimbursement side on this panel. That would have been great. Yeah. but underscoring the role of the family as the champion or the not-for-profit as the champion, and then having a team of people that execute against milestones. Sadik, you were going to say something.
No, I mean, I think the point about leadership is really important in terms of convening all of the relevant stakeholders. And I think two recent examples of that are the FNIH, the Foundation for NIH's initiative around the Bespoke Gene Therapy Consortium, where the idea there is to bring in folks from pharma, translational research centers, patient groups, and I think they had some reimbursement folks as well, to help develop a platform around AAV gene therapy for rare disorders, where you have a playbook, you deploy it and reduce it to practice across up to 8 indications, some regional, some systemic administration, and then this playbook becomes open to others. That's one recent example of a more advanced modality, and they've made some good progress there. And then, more recently, ARM convened a set of stakeholders around gene editing, platforming gene editing for rare disorders. This was back in November. And again, there was a set of regulators, biopharma, translational investigators, and some folks from reimbursement that were really trying to put together an approach to platforming gene editing. So I think we have some interesting models out there, and we'll see what takes off. But your point is well taken.
I think I had an experience in a prior life running an immuno-oncology company in an event around the JP Morgan conference. And at that event, I met somebody who was an insurer, who was a payer. And he said, come on in, bring the protocol. We'd love to know, and we were in the outset of phase 2 here. We'd love to know what's coming down the pike, both in terms of the intervention, what the potential therapeutic index is, so we can begin thinking about this. And I think that we talk a lot about reimbursement, but we don't seem to have enough people that pay in the room. And I think that we are all, the onus is on us to bring those folks into this dialogue, because the therapies that our sector delivers are uniquely effective when they're effective. Okay, so we've got about 9 minutes left. So Hilary, Eaton. So tell me, or tell the audience, what you think the foundation should do with respect to building an advocacy group if there is none.
That is a great question that I am actively thinking about myself right now. So I think, again, it comes back to network, right? It's amazing to me how passionate patient groups are, but also how sometimes the resources are very fragmented across, particularly when you don't have a natural history study or where there are multiple subtypes of a disease that probably mean actually they're just different diseases or catch-all buckets, but nobody has enough genetic information to really sort of nail it down. I mean, actually, I liked Hilary's point early on around sort of, what this family might be having to do is not only mount initiative to try and get some sort of therapy or cure for their kid, they might also be having to mount a diagnostic campaign for how does their child, how do other people in the space get diagnosed. For Ehlers-Danlos syndrome, which is what runs in our family, the average time to diagnosis is 14 years. 14 years is a long time to be struggling with sort of that burden. And so, I think what I would say in terms of putting together those people or the successful groups that I've seen, whether it's sort of a parent started like Mila's mom or some of those other patient advocates that have been very successful in raising capital, you've got to put that business hat on. And it was a really good point about sort of, making sure that you bring the passion and the mission, but that you're bringing in also the right experience for who can raise that money. It's interesting, you can look around at the world of rare disease and you can almost always find a celebrity or an individual with a high wealth that has somebody in their family. And sometimes that's how you capture, I think, the initial, spark or seed funding for some of this stuff. It all comes down to, though, in the end, how can you scale? right? Because getting a proof of concept for your kid or for a kid, that's great, but it does nothing for the community, right? That's the point you made earlier, like to see things get shelved because there is not a business model. We've got to get better at seeing some of these as larger buckets of disease, I think. And I really hope that with all the change that's happening at the agency, that some of the stuff around platform designation actually continues to evolve and move forward. Because sometimes I think that's the only way that you're really gonna convince payers that there's a way forward here, right? There needs to be scale, and you've got to bring the cost down to something that's absorbable by the system, even if it is a one and done cure.
That's an excellent point in terms of vector for a platform. If we could get a set of guidance that enabled us to be slotting in different genes of interest, and that was all viewed as the common delivery system, it would greatly simplify the path forward.
Yeah, it is. I'll follow up on that and just say I'm very excited about the opportunities that are being discovered, not just in platform technology, but how we define platform technology. I will tell you from my old review days at the agency, we were always told that we are supposed to be asking questions about the new, we should be focused on the new questions of safety and efficacy, that where there is knowledge or information that's established, that should not just be leveraged but valued. And so again, this is where coming into the agency as a patient, as a sponsor, as someone supporting a product, helping to focus on what the new questions really are can really help to guide your reviewer. I think in gene therapy it's complicated because as we talk about diseases in which there may be different genes contributing, different mutations, sometimes the transgene products that you are delivering within your vectors may be different, and for every difference, often they're viewed as different products. A different promoter is a different product, things like this. But figuring out how to leverage the similarities, if nothing else, I think builds you a larger safety pool of some type. And as a product area, I will say that folks are becoming more and more comfortable with gene therapy, not just the regulatory bodies, but society at large. And so as we build that larger knowledge base and larger comfort, I think some of those requirements and the numbers you need to meet may start to drop as well.
As part of our prep session, we had a discussion that won't name product names, but I think one of the things that's often missed when you're so focused on developing the protocol and getting it submitted as part of the IND is that the patient's voice isn't there. You have the KOLs, and you have that group of men and women who are outstanding, but the person's got to take the therapy. They have to sort of understand what this might be like, and I think that is all too often not thought of until well down the clinical development path. And so I think that came out of our discussion, and I didn't want us to have missed that. Now, we've got about 3.5 minutes left. Sadik, was there something you were going to say? Okay. Are there any questions from the audience for this wonderful panel? Okay. Well, it was a pleasure to meet you and to participate in this. Thank you, guys. And please help join me in giving our panel a round of applause.